3 weeks ago, I sat alone in a funeral home conference room, picking out a casket for my own husband, while my daughter was 4 states away, trying on bridesmaid dresses at her best friend's bachelorette party. I had told her the date of that meeting 11 days in advance. She confirmed twice. 2 days after I sat in that room alone, signing papers I never imagined I'd have to sign without her beside me, she called me, her voice tight and urgent, asking me to sign something else entirely, a power of attorney that would give her legal control over decisions I hadn't even known she was worried about. If you want to understand exactly how a mother goes from planning her husband's funeral completely alone to being asked, 48 hours later, to hand her daughter legal authority over her own affairs, stay with me until the end, because what happened in between changed the way I think about family, obligation, and exactly what love is supposed to look like when it actually matters. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and I am 72 years old. I need to tell you about my husband, Harold, before I tell you about that funeral home, because you won't understand the particular weight of that empty chair beside me otherwise. Harold and I were married for 49 years. We met in 1975 at a community dance in the small town outside of Richmond, Virginia, where we both grew up. And from that very first evening, there was never really anyone else for either of us. I remember exactly what he was wearing that night, a slightly too large blue suit, borrowed from his older brother, and the particular nervous way he asked me to dance, stumbling over his words in a manner completely at odds with the steady, capable man I would come to know over the following decades. Harold worked as a machinist for a manufacturing company for 36 years, steady, reliable work that let us raise our daughter, Rachel, in a comfortable but modest home, and that eventually gave us a quiet, contented retirement together, filled with gardening, Sunday drives, and the particular easy companionship that only comes from spending nearly 5 decades beside the same person. Ours was never a dramatic love story, not in the way films portray romance. It was built, instead, from thousands of ordinary days accumulated into something extraordinary simply through their sheer consistency. Harold making coffee every morning before I woke, the two of us doing the crossword together most Sunday mornings, his particular habit of humming softly while working in the garden that I could hear clearly from the kitchen window. These small, unremarkable rituals, repeated across nearly 5 decades, became the actual architecture of our marriage, more meaningful to me now, in his absence, than any single grand romantic gesture could have been. Harold was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months ago. I don't need to tell you much about what that diagnosis means, or what those 14 months looked like, except to say that we spent them together, every single day, in every way that mattered, right up until the final week, when hospice care took over the practical management of his pain, and I simply held his hand and talked to him about our life together, replaying decades of memory in a quiet, dim bedroom that had become, by that point, the entire world. Those 14 months held their own particular rhythm. Good days when Harold felt well enough to sit in the garden he'd tended for 30 years, watching the tomatoes he'd planted that spring despite knowing, on some level, he might not live to harvest them. Harder days when the treatments left him too exhausted to do much more than rest quietly while I sat beside him, sometimes reading aloud from books he'd always meant to get to, sometimes simply holding his hand in comfortable silence. Rachel visited regularly during those months. I want to be fair and clear about that. Driving up most weekends, helping with medical appointments when her schedule allowed, generally present in the ways that mattered during that long, difficult decline. This makes what happened around the headstone meeting feel even more confusing to me in retrospect, a departure from a pattern of genuine presence that had otherwise defined those 14 months. Harold passed 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning, with me beside him, exactly the way he'd told me, more than once during those final months, that he wanted it to happen. I want you to understand something important before I continue. I do not regret a single moment of those final 14 months. I would live through every difficult day of that decline again, without hesitation, for the privilege of being the one who held his hand at the end. What I do carry, though, is a different kind of grief, one I didn't expect, and one I've struggled to name clearly even to myself, and it centers on what happened 3 weeks ago, roughly a month after Harold's funeral, when I needed to return to the funeral home to finalize some remaining arrangements. Specifically, selecting and paying the balance on the headstone that would eventually mark his grave, a decision Harold and I had actually discussed together during his final months, but that required a final, formal meeting with the funeral home's monument specialist to review specific stone options, inscriptions, and placement details. I told my daughter Rachel about this meeting 11 days in advance. I remember the conversation clearly because I called her specifically to ask if she could come with me, not because I couldn't manage the logistics alone, but because choosing her father's headstone felt like exactly the kind of moment I didn't want to face without her beside me. Rachel is 44 years old, married to her husband David for 16 years, with 2 teenage children of her own. She's always been, throughout her adult life, someone I've relied on for genuine emotional support, particularly since Harold's diagnosis. And I had every reason, calling her that day, to expect she would clear her schedule for something this significant. "Of course, Mom," she said. "I'll be there. What time?" I gave her the date and time, and she confirmed it, writing it down, she told me, directly in her calendar. I felt real relief hearing that confirmation, some of the anticipatory dread of that difficult meeting softening slightly, knowing I wouldn't be facing it entirely alone. About a week before the meeting, Rachel called with news that complicated things. Her closest friend since college, Melissa, was having a bachelorette party the same weekend, an event that had apparently been planned for months, involving a group trip to a lake house several hours away, with activities scheduled from Friday evening through Sunday afternoon. Rachel explained, somewhat apologetically, that she'd known about this bachelorette party for a while, but hadn't initially realized the dates would overlap with our meeting, which had been scheduled for that Saturday morning. "Mom, I think I can actually still make both work," she said. "The lake house group isn't doing anything specific until the afternoon activities on Saturday, some kind of couples spa treatment thing. I could drive back for your appointment in the morning and then head back to the lake house afterward. It's tight, but I think it's doable." I want to be honest that I felt some unease hearing this plan, given how tight the timing sounded, but I didn't push back significantly, telling myself that Rachel had clearly thought through the logistics and that questioning her plan further might come across as not trusting her judgment about her own schedule. 4 days before the meeting, Rachel called again, her voice carrying a slightly different tone than our previous conversations. "Mom, I've been looking at the drive times more carefully, and honestly, doing both isn't really realistic. The lake house is further than I initially calculated, and if I try to squeeze in a round-trip Saturday morning, I'm going to be exhausted and stressed for the rest of Melissa's weekend, which doesn't feel fair to her either, since she's been planning this for so long." I felt my stomach tighten slightly, sensing where this conversation was heading before she finished explaining. "Mom, would it be terrible if I just came to the lake house and we rescheduled the headstone meeting for the following weekend instead? I feel awful even asking, but I don't think I can actually do both properly." I sat with that question for a long moment, absorbing a very specific, quiet disappointment. The funeral home meeting had already been scheduled once around Rachel's earlier commitments, and I knew, from my earlier conversation with the monument specialist, that rescheduling again would push the timeline back considerably, delaying the headstone's actual production and installation by several additional weeks, something that mattered to me more than I think I fully articulated to Rachel in that moment. A desire to have Harold's grave properly marked as soon as reasonably possible, rather than leaving it unmarked any longer than necessary. "Rachel," I said carefully, "I understand wanting to be there for Melissa, but I told you about this meeting 11 days ago, specifically because I didn't want to face it alone. I don't think I can reschedule again without pushing the headstone timeline back significantly." "I know, Mom, and I'm so sorry," she said. "I really am, but Melissa's been my best friend since college, and this weekend has been planned for months, and I already told her I'd be there for the whole thing. I feel like I'm letting everyone down no matter what I choose." I didn't argue further in that moment. I told her I understood, that I would manage the meeting on my own if that's what needed to happen. Sentiments that were genuine, even as they sat alongside a real, aching disappointment I chose not to fully express, not wanting to add guilt to what was clearly already a difficult decision for her. The meeting happened as originally scheduled, 3 weeks ago now, on a quiet Saturday morning. I drove to the funeral home alone, the same drive Harold and I had made together countless times over the decades for far more ordinary reasons, and sat in the same conference room where, 6 weeks earlier, Harold and I had actually discussed our wishes together before his passing. I remember sitting down in the chair I'd occupied during that earlier meeting, glancing instinctively at the empty chair beside me where Harold had sat, and then, this time where Rachel should have been sitting instead, and feeling the particular hollow weight of 2 absences occupying the same space. I worked through the details of his headstone entirely by myself, reviewing stone samples spread across the conference table, running my fingers over different granite textures the way I imagined Harold might have wanted to, selecting the specific stone color he and I had actually discussed briefly months earlier. Before his decline had accelerated, and approving the final wording of an inscription that Harold and I had actually written together during one of his more lucid final weeks, a simple phrase capturing 49 years of marriage in a handful of words that I found myself reading aloud quietly, alone in that room, my voice catching on the 3rd word. I want to be honest about what that morning felt like. It wasn't simply loneliness, though loneliness was certainly present. It was something closer to a specific, disorienting grief layered on top of my grief for Harold himself, a sense that this particular milestone, choosing the physical marker that would represent his entire life and our entire marriage to anyone who ever visited that grave, deserved more witness than just me sitting alone in a quiet room, signing forms with a hand that, I noticed, was trembling slightly throughout the entire appointment. I kept glancing toward the door every time I heard footsteps in the hallway outside, some irrational part of me still hoping Rachel might have found a way to make it after all, a hope that, of course, never materialized. The funeral home director, a kind woman named Susan, who had guided us through Harold's actual funeral 6 weeks earlier and clearly remembered our family well, gently asked, partway through the appointment, whether I had anyone who might want to join by phone or video call for at least part of the discussion, sensing, I think, some of what I was carrying in that room. I told her honestly that my daughter had a prior commitment, and we continued the meeting, though I noticed her expression carrying a particular gentle sympathy that told me she understood, without my needing to elaborate further, exactly what that moment represented. She paused near the end of our appointment to tell me that she'd worked in this profession for over 20 years, and that she still found it remarkable how differently families showed up for these particular decisions, a comment I understood, even in my grief, as her own gentle acknowledgement of what she'd witnessed that morning. I called Rachel that evening, once I'd returned home, to update her on the meeting's outcome. She answered from what sounded like a genuinely festive gathering, music and laughter audible in the background, glasses clinking somewhere near her, and I could hear her stepping away to a quieter space to take the call properly, her footsteps and the muffling of a door closing, audible before she spoke again. "Mom, how did it go? I've been thinking about you all day, I promise." Her voice carried genuine warmth, and I believed, even then, that she meant it sincerely, that some part of her attention really had drifted toward me throughout her festive weekend, even as the celebration continued around her. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, about the stone we'd selected, a deep gray granite Harold had once mentioned admiring on a cemetery visit years earlier for his own parents. The inscription, the timeline for installation, roughly 6 to 8 weeks depending on the engraver's current workload. She expressed appropriate interest and appreciation, asked good questions about the specific wording we'd chosen, told me she loved me, and was sorry again about not being there. I want to be honest that I accepted her apology graciously in that moment, not wanting to create additional tension during what was clearly, even from a distance, a joyful weekend for her, though I recognize now that I hadn't fully processed or expressed the actual depth of my disappointment, choosing instead to manage the conversation smoothly rather than sit with the harder, more honest exchange the situation probably warranted. I remember, after hanging up, sitting alone in my kitchen for a long while, the house quieter than it had ever been in 49 years, turning the day over in my mind and wondering, not for the first time since Harold's passing, how many more of these significant, solitary moments lay ahead of me in whatever years remained. 2 days after that funeral home appointment, on a Monday evening, my phone rang. It was Rachel, and I could hear immediately, in the particular strained quality of her voice, that something serious was occupying her attention, a very different register than our recent conversations about headstones and bachelorette weekends. "Mom," she said, "I need to talk to you about something important, and I know the timing might feel strange given everything with Dad's headstone meeting, but I've been thinking about this a lot, and I don't think I can put it off any longer." She explained over the following half hour that Harold's passing had prompted her to think seriously, for the first time, about my own long-term care and financial planning, particularly given that I now lived alone in our family home, managing finances and medical decisions that Harold and I had always handled together throughout our marriage. She'd apparently consulted with an elder law attorney friend of David's, who had strongly recommended that Rachel obtain formal power of attorney, both financial and medical, to ensure she could act on my behalf smoothly if I ever became incapacitated or unable to manage my own affairs, rather than facing complicated legal hurdles during some future crisis. She walked me through the specific mechanics of what such documents would allow, her voice carrying the particular careful thoroughness of someone who had clearly researched the topic extensively over a short period, perhaps even that very weekend, though she didn't say so directly. "Mom, I know this might feel like a lot to process right now, especially with everything so raw with Dad. But I've been worried about this specifically since the funeral, thinking about what would happen if something happened to you suddenly, the way it did with Dad's diagnosis, and I want to make sure I'm legally positioned to help you immediately if that ever happens, without any delays or complications." She continued, describing a specific scenario David's attorney friend had apparently outlined, involving a hypothetical medical emergency where, without proper legal documentation in place, Rachel might face significant bureaucratic obstacles trying to make time-sensitive decisions on my behalf. A scenario that clearly troubled her genuinely, independent of whatever else might have been influencing the timing of this particular conversation. I sat with that request for a long moment, absorbing the specific, uncomfortable irony of the timing. 2 days after sitting alone in a funeral home, managing decisions about my husband's final resting place entirely by myself because my daughter had chosen a bachelorette weekend instead, she was now asking me to grant her significant legal authority over my own future affairs. A request that, on its face, represented exactly the kind of proactive, caring planning a devoted daughter might reasonably initiate, but that landed, in that particular moment, with a weight I hadn't expected, my mind still holding the specific memory of that empty conference room chair from just 2 days earlier. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. My first instinct was not entirely generous. Part of me wanted to point out, plainly, the uncomfortable contrast between her absence at the headstone meeting and her sudden urgency about legal authority over my affairs, to ask directly why concern for my well-being had manifested as a legal document request rather than simply showing up when I'd actually asked her to. Part of me wanted to delay the conversation indefinitely, to make her sit with some version of the isolation I'd felt in that funeral home conference room. But I thought of Harold, and the way he always approached difficult family moments with patient, direct honesty, never avoiding hard conversations but never using them as weapons either, simply naming things clearly and trusting that clarity, delivered with love, ultimately served everyone better than either silence or resentment. "Rachel," I said slowly, "I hear the concern behind what you're asking, and I don't doubt that it comes from a genuine place. But I need to tell you something first, before we talk about any paperwork. 2 days ago, I sat alone in that conference room, picking out your father's headstone, the physical marker that will represent his entire life to anyone who ever visits his grave. I asked you to be there 11 days in advance, and I understand Melissa's wedding mattered. I understand bachelorette weekends get planned months ahead, but I need you to understand what it actually felt like, sitting in that room by myself, signing those papers with a shaking hand, while you were at a spa treatment 4 states away. And now, 48 hours later, you're calling me asking for legal authority over my future decisions. And I have to be honest with you, Rachel, the timing makes me want to understand something important before we go any further. Is this request coming from genuine, ongoing worry about my well-being, or is it partly, even unconsciously, a way of managing guilt about Saturday by doing something that looks proactive and caring on paper? There was a long, heavy silence on the line, long enough that I wondered briefly if the call had dropped, before I heard Rachel take a slow, unsteady breath. "Mom," Rachel finally said, her voice breaking, "I don't think I fully realized, until you just said that, how those two things might be connected, in a way I hadn't consciously admitted to myself. I've been telling myself for 2 days that the elder law conversation with David's friend was purely about future planning, completely separate from Saturday. But sitting with what you just said, I think some part of me has been carrying real guilt about not being there for the headstone meeting, and maybe some part of me did want to do something that felt like taking care of you, partly to offset that guilt, even if I wasn't fully aware that's what was happening. I think I've spent the last 2 days feeling genuinely terrible, and instead of calling you and actually sitting with that feeling honestly, I threw myself into researching something that let me feel productive and responsible, instead of just sitting with having let you down. I appreciate you being honest about that," I said, feeling something in my own chest loosen slightly at her willingness to actually examine the impulse rather than defend it reflexively. "And Rachel, I want you to understand something important. I'm not saying this to punish you or to refuse this conversation about power of attorney indefinitely. The underlying concern about making sure someone can act on my behalf smoothly if something happens to me is genuinely reasonable, and I'm willing to have that conversation seriously. But I needed you to actually sit with what Saturday felt like for me first, honestly not softened or rushed past, before we moved into paperwork and legal authority. Because Rachel, showing up when someone needs you, in the actual difficult moment, matters more to me than any legal document ever could. I don't want a piece of paper that says you have authority over my affairs if the underlying relationship doesn't include reliably showing up for the harder, less convenient moments too." "You're right," Rachel said, crying now in a way that sounded genuinely raw rather than performed. "Mom, I've been so focused on being a good daughter in the big, visible ways, planning nice things, checking in regularly, that I think I've let myself off the hook too easily when a specific moment required something harder and less convenient than a phone call or a nice gesture. Saturday was one of those specific moments, and I chose the easier path, and then I think I tried to compensate for that choice by jumping to something that felt more significant on paper, without actually sitting with what I'd done." We talked for a long while that evening, a conversation that went considerably deeper than either the headstone meeting or the power of attorney request individually, touching on a broader pattern Rachel recognized in herself, a tendency, developed over years of juggling her own family, career, and social commitments, to prioritize whichever obligation felt most immediately pressing or most difficult to cancel gracefully, sometimes at the expense of commitments that, upon reflection, deserved considerably more weight. She mentioned during that conversation a similar dynamic from years earlier, missing part of her own daughter's school play because a work deadline felt more urgent in the moment. A memory, she said, had resurfaced uncomfortably as she sat with what had happened around the headstone meeting, making her wonder whether this represented a more consistent pattern than she'd previously allowed herself to fully examine. "I think," she said, her voice quiet and reflective now, "I've spent years telling myself that as long as I show up for the big, obviously important things, funerals, weddings, milestone birthdays, that the smaller, less dramatic moments in between don't carry the same weight. But Saturday wasn't actually small, was it? It just didn't look as significant on the surface as a funeral itself. I think I need to reconsider how I'm actually weighing these decisions, rather than just going with whatever feels most urgent or hardest to cancel in the moment." I told her honestly that I was willing to move forward with the power of attorney conversation, but only once we'd both had time to sit with the larger lesson from that week, and only with a mutual commitment that legal authority over my affairs would be accompanied by the kind of consistent, reliable presence that actually justified that trust. Not a single difficult conversation followed by a return to previous patterns. Rachel visited me the following weekend, driving up specifically, without any competing commitment pulling at her attention. And we spent that Saturday together properly, visiting Harold's grave, still without its headstone at that point, and having the kind of unhurried, honest conversation we hadn't fully managed since his passing. We sat on a bench near the grave for nearly an hour, Rachel asking me questions about Harold I hadn't expected, about our early years together, about specific memories she wanted to make sure she held on to properly now that he was gone. She apologized again, more fully this time, and told me she'd already spoken with David about restructuring how they handled competing commitments going forward, particularly anything involving me directly, given everything we'd both just navigated together. We finalized the power of attorney paperwork about 3 weeks later, working with an attorney together, Rachel driving up specifically for the appointment despite it falling on a weekday that required her to take time off work. A small but meaningful signal, I thought, of the recalibration our earlier conversation had apparently produced. During that appointment, the attorney walked us through each specific provision carefully, and I noticed Rachel asking thoughtful, engaged questions throughout, treating the process with a seriousness that felt considerably different from the somewhat rushed urgency of her original phone call weeks earlier. Harold's headstone was installed 2 weeks ago. Rachel came for that as well, standing beside me at the grave as the installation crew carefully set the stone in place, both of us crying quietly together as we read the inscription we'd chosen. Together this time, standing side by side exactly the way I'd hoped we would be for that funeral home meeting weeks earlier. Rachel brought flowers that day, without my asking, and stayed afterward for several hours, helping me sort through some of Harold's remaining belongings, a task I'd been putting off, unable to face it entirely alone. In the weeks since, something has genuinely shifted in how Rachel shows up for me, not from guilt or obligation, but from what feels like a more deliberate, considered recalibration of her own priorities. She calls more frequently, visits more consistently, and has started, unprompted, checking in before committing to anything that might create a scheduling conflict with something involving me. A small but meaningful change from the pattern that led to that difficult Saturday. Last week, she mentioned turning down an invitation to a work colleague's milestone birthday celebration, specifically because it fell on the same weekend as my upcoming medical checkup, wanting to be there in person rather than just checking in by phone afterward. A decision that, months earlier, I suspect she might have resolved differently without much hesitation. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for a widow who sat alone in a funeral home. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. Legal documents, however well-intentioned, can never substitute for genuine presence in the moments that actually matter. Real trust and real authority over someone's most significant affairs has to be built on a foundation of consistent, reliable showing up, not granted as a way of managing guilt after the fact. If you find yourself wanting to do something large and formal to demonstrate care after failing to show up for something smaller but more immediate, it's worth pausing to ask honestly what that impulse is actually serving. I spent a Saturday morning alone, choosing my husband's headstone, while my daughter attended a bachelorette party she'd committed to months earlier. 2 days later, she asked for legal authority over my future. I gave her that authority eventually, but only after we'd both sat honestly with what her absence had actually cost, and only once I understood that the paperwork represented something more than guilt looking for a productive outlet. If this story reminded you of a moment in your own family where showing up mattered more than any gesture that came afterward, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight.